This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. Life can be very difficult at times. As listeners of this podcast, you may know that life's problems can often feel insurmountable, and it's not uncommon to feel alone and at odds with yourself. However, you don't have to handle life's twists and turns alone. BetterHelp Online Therapy is there for you. They will assess your needs and recommend a licensed professional therapist specializing in your specific care needs within 48 hours. I live in New York City, which is the epicenter of therapy, and I've seen it work wonders for many of my friends and colleagues. But even in a big city, it can be difficult to get an appointment with a therapist, sometimes taking weeks or even months. BetterHelp is always accessible. You're never left with outrageous waiting periods. If your therapist isn't the right fit, you can easily switch. BetterHelp is not a crisis hotline. It's not self-help. It's professional online therapy that is secure and available worldwide. BetterHelp is a great way to invest in yourself, and they have a special offer for my listeners. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/Nick Bryant. That's betterhelp.com/Nick Bryant.
The paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
Entitled. You want answers. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Nick Bryant Podcast. Today, my guest is Tyrel Ventura. Tyrel, how you doing today?
I'm great, Nick. I'm great. Thank you for having me on. It's been a true pleasure to be on this side of the table for a change. Usually, I'm the one interviewing you.
Tyrel had a really good show called Watching the Hawks on Russia Today, and he invited me a number of times to his show, as did Sean Stone, and Chris Hedges invited me. And that was unfortunately the only network in the United States of America that has invited Nick Bryant to speak. It's the way it goes with the mainstream media.
Very, very true. Very true. I for those that don't know, I like you said, I hosted Watching the Hawks for probably over 5, 7, maybe 8 years, I think, altogether. Did over 1,500 episodes live every night, 6 p.m. But that was on RT America, which became like, network non grata here in the U.S. after 2016, and when all the tensions flared between us and Russia. But it was a great experience because they never censored myself. They never told me what to say or how to say it. All the stories I could pick were my own. And one of the stories, maybe a few years, actually, 2 years or a year or so before I started working at RT as a political commentator, television show host, I had read Nick's book, The Franklin Scandal. And Nick's writing affected me, and so naturally, Nick, I wanted to have you on. I wanted to interview you, and I wanted to talk with you, and get more publicity, I guess, or make people more aware of that story, so that way more people could kind of make up their own minds, possibly read your book, follow your reporting, and then make up their own minds on its validity, or I just felt like it's a story that needed to be told after reading your book.
Well, a lot of people have come to me after reading the Franklin Scandal, and they said, man, it completely changed my view on how our government works. And some people say, man, it was a really tough book to get through. And I say, well, try writing it for 7 years.
I can only imagine.
And you and I have talked about it.
And you had said that it kind of tilted your perception about our government. And
Well, yeah, I mean, growing up with, with Governor Jesse Ventura as your father, you're always, I was raised to always, question your government and questions its actions and try to see things from all sides and understand motivations that it's a lot of times, your entities or individuals within your government will not always have the red, white, and bluest of motivations. That they, they'll be out for themselves, or they'll be out to protect themselves, or there's a lot of nefarious things that go on. And as someone, my dad took me to see the film JFK. Sorry about the smoke. My dad took me to see the film JFK when it came out in theaters, and I think I was probably around 10 or 11. And got me kind of questioning official narratives and things like that. It doesn't mean that I buy into everything that's questioned out there, but I give it its due, and I do proper research, and I use critical thinking. And so in the kind of course of my life, I came across the Franklin scandal. I can't remember how. It might have been your publisher may have sent like a bunch of books to us, to Jesse and to me to read at some point, and Franklin was in there. I cannot remember exactly how I came across the book. I often agree with that idea that was kind of put forth that books kind of find you. And so I came across your book and started reading it, and Nick, I'll talk you up. It's your podcast, but it's true is that you're a very great writer besides a good journalist. Your writing style definitely pulls you in. You feel characters, and I'm a big fiction guy. I came from Hollywood and writing screenplays and working more in a fiction-based storytelling, and so great journalism to me is when you can kind of not necessarily bring fiction into it, but use the storytelling techniques to tell a non-fiction story, but in a way that captivates your audience. And Franklin did that as a book. Like it's a page-turning book, chapter to chapter, and it's also gut-wrenching to read because you're reading about such nefarious, horrible, awful acts that it's hard to get through. But you write it in such a great way that it becomes a page-turning mystery novel. It becomes a thing of, I gotta see what happens next. Like, what new is going to happen with each page, despite how horrified I am of what I'm reading. And yeah, it really got its hooks into me, and it definitely changed. Like I said, always being skeptical, but it definitely shed another light about how nefarious certain people and entities and how low people will go to protect power. Because it's like, look, the people perpetrating those kind of crimes are already bad, but they're already horrible individuals, but I don't know, sometimes it's hard to say who's more horrible, the monster doing it or those that would seek to protect the monster while they do it. And that's your book raises those interesting questions and forces you to kind of look at that. And I mean, I put it like this, Nick, in your reporting, even if like 20% of your book, now you're a good reporter, so I'm not judging the validity of your reporting, but let's just say 20% of that, because the government side or the official stories, Franklin didn't happen, is blown out of proportion, da-da-da-da-da. Even if 20% of your book is reality, that's more than enough to get people up in arms. If 10% is the reality of what took place there, and then when you look at it and say, probably 90 to 80, 80 to 90, maybe 100, you don't know, unless you were physically there during when these things were taking place. It's like I said, it's just a powerful book, and it definitely, it definitely made me want to seek you out as a journalist, just because when you read a book that, like I said, equal parts horrifying, but also such a well-written, good journalistic book, you have a bunch of, you have citations and all of this. It's you record everything that you're doing, and you have an appendix, I wanted to meet you, and I said, I want to meet this person who sat down to write this and see what they're like, and because then you can also tell too, is this somebody who I've met a lot of different people in my career, and some people you can tell are charlatans. They might write something really pretty, but then you meet them and you're like, oh, this isn't really true. You're not that good of a journalist. And then other people you meet, and you're like, no, I think this person has conviction. This person has, this person believes in what they're writing, and they're putting forth the best journalism they can.
It's an interesting story because it shows just how malignant a corner of our government is. And I think that the reason why people experience cognitive dissonance when they read the Franklin scandal, they see these horrific entities within the government, and they say to themselves, I don't want to believe this. And then all of a sudden, because when I was pitching the Franklin scandal and then subsequently the Epstein scandal to publishers, I would see their eyes kind of, be picked with interest, but then all of a sudden they just go, like the wall would come down. And then I saw it, this cognitive dissonance was happening before my eyes. They were saying to themselves, this is a really horrible story, and we have to help Nick Bryant get this story out because all these children have been destroyed, or we can label Nick Bryant as crazy, and I can go home to my family tonight and we can eat a nice meal and I'll get a good night's sleep. And I did think, I live in New York City. I have lived here for 26 years, which is the hub of the publishing. And I knew a lot of people in the media. And I knew that most of them were going to shirk their responsibilities regarding the Franklin scandal, but I didn't think all of them would. That's what kind of surprised me.
I mean, that surprised me too, because it's any good, in the world of journalism, at the very least, when you come across a story like the Franklin scandal, and yeah, at the time I think it was a story, but I feel like over the years it's gotten more attention, but anyone worth their salt, you'd think at least they would dip the toe in to say, well, let's at least check out the validity of this. Let's at least go down the road with it a little bit and see where this goes, because it's affecting children, because it's affecting government institutions. You would hope that there would be a media appetite for that. But then at the same time, given the nature of media today, it's a tough sell. For corporate media, because let's say, I mean, on one hand, yes, if you get it wrong, you just accused a lot of people of one of the most, if not the most nefarious act a human being could do, is to attack a child. If you get it right, then what you have on, what I mean by hard sell, it's also, look, we got to be realistic. Corporate news media stays away from stuff that doesn't get ratings. We'll be honest, especially cable news and things like that. Their whole modus operandi is ratings. It's not so much journalism as it's ratings. They're using journalism to get ratings. But anything that would, threaten corporate sponsorship or make people truly uncomfortable, it's hard. It's a tough sell. Because it's hard to go from, hey, let's talk about what's going on in the Franklin scandal for, this 10-minute block of airtime, and then we're going to go over and talk about puppies, or, something ridiculous, so, I mean, that's all, thankfully, I didn't have to worry about that with watching the Hawks. But when you look at other corporate media and things like that, that's tragically that's what they'll kind of look at and make those decisions on. I mean, you're not going to go on Good Morning America and talk about the Franklin scandal, and that's tragic, Now, why I would say conversely, I get it when you're talking. I don't agree with it. I think all good journalism should be showcased, especially through television and things like that. It's one of the most powerful communication tools we have. What really shocks me more was the lack of coverage and lack of follow-up from print media. Because print media is a little easier where, it's not so much sales. It's not so much, I'm putting on a circus. That can be where you can find good journalism and where people can really do some good work and some good follow-up work, or at least chase down a story, as as a journalist. And so that's what really struck me was how much rejection you also got from print media, magazines, newspapers, things like that, or how far they'd get down the road with you and then suddenly, oh, well, we're just going to ignore the whole thing. I mean, I could see it if it's like we're going to go down this road with you and the Franklin scandal and see what your reporting uncovered and do our own reporting. And let's say they go down that road and they come to different conclusions you do. You'd at least think they would take the time to debunk it, for lack of a better term. But they didn't. They just, no, we're not touching it. From what I saw of it, from what I saw the coverage of the book.
Absolutely ignoring something.
Yeah, and that to me is even worse.
If the media gives something ontology, and if the media ignores it, then it has no ontology. So I've been fighting to have the Franklin scandal become ontological, to exist. And it's been quite a fight with the media. And I don't know if this is still true, but at one point there were 6 corporations that owned 90% of the media that Americans buy. And those 6 corporations are titanic corporations, and the government could break them up at any time with the Sherman Trust Act. And we've seen the Sherman Trust Act deployed against large corporations. And my thinking on this is that the media, or these titanic conglomerates, they don't want to be broken up. So the government has some sway over them about what they're going to report and what they're not going to report. So it's a symbiotic relationship that produces just a lot of really shallow reporting and erroneous reporting.
It really does. And what was fascinating too is as somebody who worked in that world and who still does to a certain extent, what was really fascinating too about the reaction to your book is your book came out how many years? About 10, 15 years after the events?
It came out in 2009, so about 20 years or so.
Okay, 20 years or so. So, like, on one hand, I can understand, like, again, I don't agree with, and I'll make that very clear, but I can understand the nature of, well, it's 20 years ago, it's not current, the usual kind of list of that excuse that they'll use, right? But what was really shocking to me is then when you jump forward to the Epstein scandal and what happened with that. Where again, you have very powerful political, banking, corporate figures involved in ostensibly, child trafficking, to see the media react to that, where, okay, there's a story that you have to cover, it's current, it's got almost as many, if not the same amount of tentacles, maybe bigger tentacles than the Franklin scandal. Reaching into all aspects of power and elite and all of that in our country. It was really shocking to see how the media reacted to that. Because again, you kind of saw it, good kudos to the Miami Herald down there for kind of getting the ball rolling on the reporting down there. But then again, you saw this attitude of like, well, we'll just talk about him. And okay, he's in jail. But yet there's no real drill down into, well, he didn't act alone. He obviously, you look at the lists of the people that he interacted and who flew on his jet and things like that. Why were there no hard questions put to those people? And again, that's one of those things where it boggles the mind why the media will only take the story so far. I mean, yeah, everybody covered it, but you could tell there was still this level of like, you could tell they were uncomfortable covering it because they were talking about some pretty famous, powerful political families, and royal families and the like. And you could tell that they didn't and it hit both sides of the political spectrum too, because you had Trump being involved with the guy, you had the Clintons being involved with the guy. And you could tell that both political sides and all the journalists who kind of, you can definitely tell favor one party or the other. You could tell both sides, like, they were excited to talk about Epstein. Like on the left, you had, all those journalists excited to talk about Epstein's interactions with Donald Trump, but didn't really want to cover his interactions with Bill Clinton, or kind of glossed over that one. Hardly nobody talked about the amount of Wall Street executives that resigned because of the wake of of what came out with Epstein. And even after his death, where he dies under these like wildly mysterious quote unquote suicide and all of these things, it's like, well, okay, we're moving on. You know, it blows your mind, because any logical thinking person would be like, God, that's like what every journalist dreams of. You know, in terms of like digging in and investigating a story. You know, you don't want to see it happen because of the horrific nature of the crimes, but my God, you have to, as a journalist, you owe it to yourself to follow the lead on those stories.
I was very disappointed. The media was really fond of digging up salacious dirt. And I wrote an article that called for justice. I think it was, people have told me it's the most comprehensive article on Epstein thus far. And I've seen a couple other articles that call for justice, but mostly it's just digging up salacious dirt that basically tars some billionaire, but lightly tars them, and doesn't even come close to investigating, auguring into whether or not this individual was abusing children. And that's been very frustrating for me. I started to investigate Epstein in 2010, and I was doing it from New York. I was keeping up on it. Once I saw how corrupt that grand jury was, that grand jury didn't return any indictments of child abuse against Epstein, I kind of felt like it might be a Franklin network. And then in 2012, I went down to Florida for the first time to investigate it. And I was able to get a hold of Epstein's Black Book. And at that point, and the Black Book had all kinds of power brokers that Epstein was pandering children to, but it also had scores of victims. And I started to call the victims, and it was off the record. And they told me about being flown to his island or being flown here. So at that point, I knew that there was a Franklin-like network, that Epstein was flying children around. He wasn't like a lone pervert on the grassy knoll. He was flying people around. So I came back to New York City with his Black Book, and I went to the editors that would still talk to me, because the editors were still experiencing cognitive dissonance, and a lot of them really didn't want to talk to me. But the editors that were still talking to me, I said, here's his Black Book. Let me write an article about it. And no major media was willing to do that. Finally, Gawker, 3 years later in 2015, was willing to let me publish the Black Book on their website, and then also write an article about it. And at that point, I had passenger manifests on his flights. And Gawker was willing to do that. And it's so ironic, because Gawker is known for being the mean kids on the media block. And they had some kind of moral fortitude where this bothered them. They wanted to do something about it. Whereas these other media that are seemingly draped in integrity wanted nothing to do with the story. Even after I had the Black Book, that's what surprised me, is that no one would touch it even after I managed to acquire the Black Book.
It's incredible. It's incredible. And it was funny because I remember when the story really started breaking, which I think was after his second arrest, obviously, because he had the first arrest that then everybody kind of looked the other way on. And like you said, the DA gave him, I mean, the fact that they let this guy serve half his sentence from out of his home was just awful enough as it was, I remember thinking, because I'd read the Franklin scandal and was familiar with the reporting. I remember thinking at the time, going like, oh God, this is something that if I was a news editor, I would literally seek you out and say, Nick, you know this world, you've done this work, go see what you can find. Like you know how these networks run, and you have familiarity with that. And I think it's because it's one of those stories that it affects so many people who don't normally get that kind of, there's an oligarchy in this country. Nobody's going to ever deny that. There's the rich and powerful, and then there's the rest of us. The rich and powerful are very rarely held to task. I mean, especially when it comes to places like, powerful institutions like Wall Street and the U.S. government, and especially the intelligence community and things like that. And so whenever you have a scandal that covers all, that kind of puts everything under the umbrella, when you follow all the leads, and you follow the money, that's where it affects everybody, because you're telling me that none of, it's Epstein's one of those like things that are like, well, we got to report, that they were like, we'll do the salacious thing, but we can't really get deeper in that because, hey, you know what, my boss's boss has a relationship with this guy who's in the black book. And so I think there was a lot, my assumption is there's a lot of favors being called in during that time period. There's a lot of people. See, the problem is in journalism today is you don't have direct censorship. You don't have necessarily an editor coming in or Jeff Bezos walking into the Washington Post newsroom saying, do not report this. You don't have that. What you have instead is people kind of self-editing and self-censoring. Where people, especially in the corporate world, where everyone looks around and everybody knows, we're not really going to talk about this because we know what will upset X, Y, and Z. So we don't have to be told not to report this. We just won't report it. And they look for people who, I think a lot of their hiring practice, Matt Taibbi wrote a great book called Hate Inc., where he kind of, I believe it was in that book, where he kind of got into some of that, and Noam Chomsky, with his book, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Yeah, manufactured consent. Yeah. They talk about that idea of like the people that they hire for newsrooms and journalists are oftentimes people who they know will go along to get along. They'll push the edges a little bit here and there, but ultimately they know that these people all know the drill without having to be told what that drill is. And you're not one of those journalists. Chris Hedges isn't one of those journalism. There's a lot of journalists who then find themselves outside of that party, outside and not being able to get those jobs or have their stories looked at because they're not in that inner circle. I've never equated myself as a journalist. I've always equated myself more as somebody who, given the nature of the show that I was doing and all of that, is I'm somebody who tries to find good journalism and give it a platform. And so, I have the utmost respect for folks like yourself and others out there who aren't afraid to track down these stories that others don't want to touch. And the sad truth of today is, well, what we need to do today as a society is we need to try to, put more of our energy and our whether through money or clicks or whatever it might be, into good independent journalism, into investigative journalism. If on those rare days you do see corporate media do a good investigation that really uncovers some things, trumpet that, put your ratings, put your views into that, to keep sending those messages out there that we need better people out there on the ground, better journalists out there on the ground who don't just go along to get along.
It's kind of interesting. A really good friend of mine was an editor at a magazine, a very mainstream media magazine. And he knew that he was on the reservation, that he couldn't go off the reservation. And ultimately, he could no longer do it. I mean, he'd worked there for a number of years. But his coworkers didn't even know that they were on the reservation. I mean, they didn't have the free thinking, according to him, and I believe him, they didn't have the free thinking ability to realize that there was a reservation and that they shouldn't go off of it. They're just, because they were socialized to look at life so myopically. And that's what journalism schools do. I've got a book coming out about Watergate, and Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein are serial liars. And I really show that those two guys, if they were Pinocchio, I mean, their noses would be as large as the Chrysler Building. But yet, and people have written books about their various lies, but yet the media protects them because they are a stellar example of the media trumping evil, basically. It turned into a good versus evil. And I still, and it amazes me because when I wrote this book about Watergate, I knew that it had to be solid, like the Franklin scandal. And it's got 2,326 citations in it. Just about every statement of fact has a citation. And most of those citations are either from government documents or from books that have been published in the mainstream media where I'm able to triangulate and show what the truth is. And I still had a great difficulty getting people to look at that book. And ultimately I settled with Trine because they're willing to publish books like that. They're willing to publish books by Nick Bryant. And it's kind of funny, the editor that I was talking to you about, I gave him an article, and it's kind of interesting. The article was about Bob Woodward. And I was showing that the reality of Deep Throat couldn't have been a reality because Mark Felt was living in Virginia at that point. Mark Felt was supposedly came out and was Deep Throat. I mean, I don't even know if he realized he was Deep Throat because it looked like he had Alzheimer's pretty badly at that point. But his last 6 months, or the last 6 months of Woodward's reporting on that, on Watergate, he got fired from the FBI. And Woodward said that he moved his plant to signal to Mark Felt that they should meet in some clandestine garage in Virginia. In the book, I show that Deep Throat is driving in from Virginia every day, even though he's no longer working at the FBI, and he's looking up at Bob Woodward's balcony to make sure that the plant is moved or not moved. And then I also talked about the newspapers being left in Bob Woodward's. Bob Woodward said if Deep Throat wanted to contact him and they would meet in this clandestine parking lot, this underground clandestine parking lot, that Deep Throat would put a time on the New York Times, a clock on the New York Times, and then that would signify what time they would meet. But the problem is the New York Times papers weren't delivered to the individuals who lived there. They were just put in a pile. So maybe there were other people that went and rendezvoused with Deep Throat in that underground garage in Virginia. And that's our media, the way that it protects charlatans. And
it really is. It really is. I think you're dead on point there, Nick. I like I said, it reminds me of that classic film with John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, where they said, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. And to me, that is such a truism for how we look at history today, and how we, when you look at something like Watergate, there was so much legend around it at this point, and it's such a staple of, look at this is how great journalism can be, that if you call that into question, you're gonna get very hard pushback from people, because it's now an official, I guess, mile marker of U.S. history, and so many people hang their hat on it. And we can't have that. You always see. To me, it's like we always, as a society, should always be questioning things. We always should be taking a second look at things, because look, as you and I both know, Nick, there's no, there's good and evil, of course, but life and history is always much more shades in gray than black and white. A good person can do a terrible thing. A bad person can do a good thing. Events in history, was it always the old cliche? The winners write history.
Yes. That was from Napoleon.
Yeah, and to me that's it, just because you get one version of history doesn't mean there's not about 4 or 5 other versions of that same story, and you should look at all of them and then use your own thinking and your own mind to make up your opinion on what you believe to be true. And that's, I think, one of the things that we're lacking today very much is the ability. The ability for someone to look at a story and make up their own mind about it, rather than just kind of going along to get along, or well, this came from this person, so it must be true, or this if it's in the New York Times, well, then it must be true. No, it's what the New York Times is writing about that. That doesn't mean that's the only truth to a story. And so I think that people need to be able to have that ability to always go to 5, 6, 7 different sources on a story. Go to as many different outlets as you can, so you can get a more rounded picture. Doesn't mean you have to agree with everything you read, and you have to be very careful that you don't kind of fall for traps. Like me and you talked earlier this week or last week about the kind of idiocy of well, in my belief, the idiocy of like the QAnon thing. Where I look at that and I say, I've studied more conspiracy theories than probably most people have, in their lives, as I'm sure you have, and there's certain ones that you look at and say, okay, well, this is insane. But when you look at something like QAnon, you can tell, oh, I see what you're doing. They're kind of cherry picking certain truths and then like wrapping them up into a completely fantasy land. So it feels real, or it feels true for those that question government, and so it's very easy to kind of fall into that trap. It's the old story: you stare into the abyss too long, the abyss stares back, and I think that's very easy for people. I've seen it happen for folks who start with a good amount of a healthy amount of cynicism and a healthy amount of, I want to question authority because we should always be questioning authority, but then they kind of keep falling down those rabbit holes to where eventually they do believe that there's 8-foot reptiles that shapeshift and run the world. I'm sorry for those that believe that. I know you're upset with me for saying that, but I don't believe that. I haven't found the proof yet. And so I think things like QAnon and things like that, and you also can't discount the fact that there's a lot of stories put out like that because they want to discredit a community that is doing good work. In my belief system, I think that's kind of what that whole Pizzagate thing was. It was a way to kind of send people down the wrong rabbit hole to where now they look like they're crazy, and it kind of then you're able to then any other child trafficking story or something of that nature that comes up, well, it's not another Pizzagate, is it? It kind of creates that element of doubt, or if you bring those hard questions up, they immediately can kind of paint you with the brush of crazy.
It's Pizzagate and QAnon. People, because I have an expertise in this area, they approached me and they asked me about Pizzagate and QAnon, and my degree is in philosophy, and I try to approach everything agnostically. I could not find anything approaching credibility or veracity with Pizzagate and also with QAnon, and it has hurt people like me that are trying to expose child trafficking. The Atlantic, about a month ago or so, had a article about the fake. They called it fake child trafficking, and I got the reporter's email, and I sent her some links to my podcast about victims that are talking about being trafficked, and she never got back to me. But yeah, that has hurt. It's kind of interesting with Franklin and also with Epstein, and I believe that blackmail was the reason why. I believe that there's some malignant corner of our intelligence that blackmails people. And with both Franklin and also with Epstein, I put together a lot of proof that there were hidden cameras, that there were intelligence connections. And that's why Franklin and then now Epstein has been, that element has been overlooked, because the worst thing that could possibly happen is for that dark, malignant corner of intelligence, for people to know that not only does it exist, but it compromises our politicians, and it will use children to compromise our politicians. And that is a very, very difficult reality for people to grasp, because they see it on television or they see it in the movie theater, but they don't see it in the New York Times. They don't see it in Time magazine. And it's hard for them to make that quantum leap from TV or cinema to actual reality. And it's kind of interesting, because what I liked about Russia Today was that you could report on anything you wanted to report on, and you did show some very dark sides of America that American mainstream media wouldn't report. And I remember I was talking to a producer at Russia Today, and we were talking, I was telling him about the Franklin scandal and how people have been compromised. And I said, you know something, Putin compromised. There was a state prosecutor that was going after Yeltsin because Yeltsin was getting kickbacks. And Putin was just like an apparatchik at that point. But he set up this state prosecutor with 2 prostitutes and filmed it, true KGB CIA style. And so I edified that producer about how Putin became Yeltsin's heir apparent. And so I kind of got a kick out of that the people at Russia Today knew all this dirt about the United States, but didn't know this dirt about Russia and Putin. I kind of got a kick out of that.
It's amazing how that kind of cognitive dissonance like reaches out. Like you can go country to country and find the same examples over and over again, of it, because it's tragic. I mean, I laugh because it breaks my heart, because there are so many. Anybody who's followed the CIA or the FBI or and just wants to dig in a little bit, or the KGB or any intelligence or most intelligence services, I would assume. Anyone who looks into their histories, your stomach's going to churn because of the amount of things that they've been allowed to get away with or have covered up or have used to get dirt or used to secure power or secure influence. And it does boggle my mind a little bit that, well, not boggle my mind, I understand it. It's very, very sad because, man, at the end of the day, people forget it's our taxpayers that fund their salaries. It's our money that they're using to, and essentially then our name, that they're using to do some very heinous things over the years. I mean, if anybody looks at the history of Allen Dulles or J. Edgar Hoover alone, and if you think that stopped just because they're dead, they trained a whole host of people. When you look at lineages of who was their boss and who then became boss and then who worked under them. I mean, you can follow these lineages, these work lineages, and see, oh God, if this person's influenced by Allen Dulles, well, what kind of person are they? And it's so easy for us to kind of forget that, and to imagine, well, that's ancient history, it doesn't happen today. But thankfully, we got good people like you out there, and we do still have some really good independent journalism out there, that aren't afraid to kind of shine a light on that. You just have to do a little digging to find it, which maybe that's always been true. I don't know. I mean, imagine that William Randolph Hearst didn't exactly allow a lot of truth in his newspapers at the time in his era either. So I think it's kind of one of those the freedom of the press and what's reported and what gets told to the public and what isn't. That it's kind of an old battle. When you really look at it through the moment human beings organize themselves into a society. How much is the Catholic Church probably oppressed? I mean, I would love to get into their vaults one day and see, what books or what ancient manuscripts they're sitting on that would totally change the face of how we look at history and who we are today. I think one of the biggest crimes that ever happened to society was the burning of the Alexandria Library. For how much information was lost. And today, maybe this is getting way off topic, but it just kind of popped in my head, is one of my biggest fears today is everything's so digitized, all it takes is for you to pull the plug and suddenly you've lost how much great work. I mean, we all face that on a daily basis if a hard drive goes bad. Well, now that everything's digital, I faced it with Russia Today, and to a certain degree when I spoke out against the invasion of Ukraine, and not long after that, the RT America kind of folded and all of that. But at the same time, YouTube essentially took everything, all of the work that I did there, all of the shows that I created, and just, with a click of a button, made them disappear. Where you can't access them now. I think you can get them in Somalia, if I'm not mistaken. But you can't access any of the work that I did, and it's not. I don't mind for myself because I know the work that I did, and like I said, living in a digital era, you kind of have to accept that. But what truly hurt about that it didn't hurt me. It hurt for all the folks like yourself all those folks that I interviewed and that I gave, that me and my co-host Tabitha Wallace and my other co-host Amisha Cross, all those people, and Sean, all those people that we gave a platform to for their story or their activism or their journalism or whatever it might be, they can't go back now and point to those interviews anymore. You can't find them anymore, and that's a real tragedy that I think that came out of the kind of end of RT America, and it's something that we all have to kind of take a real hard look at, not necessarily that particular element of it, or that story, but the broader scope of everything is so digitized now. With a click of a button, you can erase history. And that's I don't think we've ever been in that situation before, to a certain degree, as a society.
Before we actually had to burn things.
Yeah, you actually had to throw them in the, yeah.
Torture.
You know, you had to destroy physically had to destroy the documents. It wasn't as easy as it is today, which has to be tough as well for a journalist, I'd imagine, and for an investigative reporter, that now it's so easy to get rid of things, unless you have someone who's really good at hacking, or who really can go into the guts of a computer or online and find what was deleted, which you can do, but it's difficult.
It was heartbreaking when I heard about YouTube taking down the work that you'd done, the work that Chris Hedges had done. There was some really good reporting and some really solid shows on Russia Today. And it's amazing, YouTube just ablated them all. And yeah, I found it very troubling. Tyrell and I are both from the same third world country, Minnesota. And actually, we met in Minnesota in Minnesota December, which was it was very cool.
Yes, it was.
And Tyrell is in beautiful Minnesota now. How are things in Minnesota?
It's great, man. It's great. It's funny. I haven't lived here in 20 some odd years. I moved away in my early 20s and then recently moved back now in my early 40s, and a lot's changed. But it's good to be back. It's good to be back close to my family again. I've went around and had all kind of great life adventures, but now as my parents get into their twilight years, as it's called, it's nice to be back close to them again. It's nice to be back working, alongside my father again on we do a Substack publication called Jeffrey Ventura's Die First Then Quit, and working with my dad on a weekly basis now, daily basis, that's been fantastic, and being around my family at this stage in my life feels right. But yeah, Minnesota's great. I mean, it's still Minnesota. It's summer now, which means it's fantastic. In another few short months, 6 months, 5 months, it's going to be blitzingly cold and awful, and I'm not a cold weather person in the least, but I'm willing to make that sacrifice to be back up here again. It was interesting because I was in D.C. when Minnesota went through the George Floyd murder and all of that, and even though I would come back for the holidays and things like that, there was even when I lived here, there was always those tensions in the air. You could tell, you knew that there was, racism in this country is not just dedicated to the southern states. The northern states have their own kind of brand of racism, and I was really proud of the communities here in Minnesota that rose up against that and said enough is enough. So the one cool thing about Minnesota is there's a lot of pride here. There's a lot of people. People take a real pride in their communities, real pride in the city. And it's interesting being back in that kind of Midwestern culture, and the Minnesota nice thing. Everyone's please and thank you.
Yeah, you gotta like that Minnesota nice. I mean,
yeah.
What other state is going to elect a professional wrestler as its governor?
Exactly. We're odd people up here. I mean, look at the films we put out. I mean, the filmmakers that we put out, like Joel and Ethan Coen and like Terry Gilliam and Prince. I guess
Bob Dylan.
Yeah, Bob Dylan. Yeah, there's. I think there's a certain craziness up here, and I say that in the best sense of that word. There's a certain craziness up here that's infectious and really it really inspires artistic talent. Might be because, hey, you know what? 6 months out of the year, you're stuck indoors with nothing but your imagination.
Permafrost.
Exactly.
You got permafrost 6 months out of the year. If you can acclimate to it, Minnesota is a wonderful place. Lots of lakes. And your dad said something that has always stuck with me. He said politics is like professional wrestling. You create these phony antagonisms, but you're being paid by the same people. And I've always gotten a kick out of that.
So true. You know, and he was the one who knew that, because it is. I mean, politics today, that's all it is. Because when you go to the conventions, you know, the same lobbyists go to both conventions. You know, they're getting paid off by the, you know, they're getting corporate donations into those dark money PACs by the same, damn near the same corporations. I mean, there might be a little bit of difference in terms of like the billionaire class. You know, maybe this billionaires are super conservative, these are super liberal, and you might have a few, you know, who only give to one side over the other. But ultimately, when it comes to corporate money, you know, especially defense contractor money, Raytheon and things like that, Lockheed Martin, yeah, they're getting money. They're getting money from the same sources most of the time, which is no different than wrestling. You know, at the end of the day, if you're working for the WWE, you're a bad guy, they're a good guy. You know, that doesn't carry over after the matches are over. And you know, you know, yeah, you know, when they're getting paid by the same people, then that's why you only see, you know, laws passed that you just follow the trail of the money, and you'll see that the laws being passed. My great example is like the defense spending. You know, you'll see them fight tooth and nail, and Republicans and Democrats never get along about a thing until defense spending comes up. Then suddenly it's kumbaya and we love each other and we'll pass this bill really quick. While the U.S. suffers, you know, while citizens suffer, while we have, you know, one of the worst healthcare systems in the world, while, you know, infant death is you know, way too high than it should be, while our education system's in the shits.
Better mortality rates than us.
Mm-hmm. You know, but hey, we got billions to spend on defense. Like, we'll make rockets all day long to kill people with, but we won't spend the money. We can't agree to get socialized medicine in this country because, God forbid, we help people and we keep people from getting sick. But hey, like, we can go bomb the shit out of another country because yeah, that's where our priorities lie. You know, stuff like that really it truly upsets me, because what does it say about us as a society? You know, and we definitely need a new political class in this country, and that's one of the things that I think me and my father have been fighting for a long time, is we need more than just two parties, because I'm sorry, it's kind of like I was saying about history. You know, it's not it's not just good or bad, it's not just Coke or Pepsi. You know, we're a country of 300 million people. You know, the fact that we only have two legitimate, you know, political parties is ridiculous. Well, we have one more choice than communism. You know, we have one more choice than a dictatorship. It's ridiculous.
What's always amazed me about the political system is, yes, and you hit it right on the nail right on the head. Yes, the Democrats and the Republicans will fight about this and fight about that, but when it comes to the defense spending, boom. And I think that is where our government is different than WWF, because WWF doesn't have people blackmailing the wrestlers. Whereas I think a number of our politicians are blackmailed by these entities that want them to spend as much money as possible on defense. And the amount of money that we spend on defense is truly mind-boggling. And we are the number one exporter of death.
We truly are, and then we look around as a society and wonder why you suddenly have all these school shootings and things like that. We're a violent society. You know, we you know, when you have your biggest export is arms and implements of death, how can you then look around and say, oh, it's shocking that we have so much violence in society? Especially the fact that you also have, you know, such a rising economic gap too. You know, you just see these things played out over and over again, and the only solutions that I see is getting, you have to elect new people. You have to elect, you know, you have to get away from this kind of two-party caste system that we're living under, and really get some fresh blood in there. I mean, my God, I don't want to sound ageist, but you know, two presidential elections, you had people running in their 70s and 80s. or about to be 80s if Biden runs again. And to me, you need some younger blood in there. You need new and fresh ideas. I mean, how many people in Congress are over 80 at this point? Dianne Feinstein's 87 years old. I mean, I remember growing up when everyone looked at Strom Thurmond and they had to wheel him in a wheelchair and he had IV hooked up to him just so he could vote. It's like, come on already.
It looks like Jabba the Hutt.
Yeah, it's like, it's kind of ridiculous to me that we got to get fresh blood in there. And one of the things that we do on Die First Then Quit is that we're going out, I do interviews with folks who are, that fresh blood on different sides of the political spectrum, but who are willing to, kind of get in there and change things and who aren't afraid to try to change things and, we try to showcase those people so that way more people can get informed and vote better. It's not vote harder, it's vote smarter at the end of the day is what we need to be focused on.
And we do need more than two political parties. At this point, the two-party system is really, really hurting us.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I wanted to piggyback, too, on what you said about the black, how they kind of blackmail people into voting for defense spending. The other interesting thing is there's a great whistleblower named John Kiriakou who blew the whistle on torture when he was with the CIA. And he told me a really interesting thing one day. He said, one of the ways that like the CIA, for example, will kind of control politicians, or like, they have like the committee that overlooks, like the intelligence committee, right, that overlooks the intelligence,
that
department.
ostensibly overlooks the intelligence.
Yeah. Well, he said one of the ways that they kind of get Congress people under their heel is, he says, if let's say you have a congressperson who wants to, pull back the lid on some nefarious things that are classified top secret, well, what they'll do is they'll bring that person in, they'll make them sign and give them the security clearance to see it. But once you sign that you're going to see top secret materials, you can't then talk about that publicly because it's top secret. If you do, you're breaking the law. Right? So that person can come in, read all these documentations, see, get brought in, get the clearance, go in, but then they can't turn around and, let's say, bring it up at the committee hearing, because if they do, then they're in violation of the top secret security clearance, which then they'd be breaking the law. And that's just a subtle little way that they kind of use to manipulate politicians to keep them from airing dirty laundry. And it's brilliant in its simplicity.
Your dad, once he was elected governor, I believe that some intelligence people wanted to meet with him. I don't know what they talked about, but you told me that. It was kind of an interesting story. Maybe you could tell.
Yeah, he wrote about it in one of his first books. What had happened is right after he got elected, he knows the story better than me. I'm getting it secondhand. But right after he was elected, essentially, there was a blank space on his daily to-do list, essentially his daily schedule. And he turned to his chief of staff and asked, what's this? And he said, oh, well, you're meeting with the CIA. And he's like, why the hell does CIA want to meet with me? He says, I don't know. And so they kind of, when they got to that point, they brought him down into like the belly of the Capitol into a room, and there was, I think Jesse said there was about 23 CIA agents kind of sitting in a semicircle, and his chair was right there, and they're all surrounding him. The nature of what they asked was ultimately, pretty much like, how did you get elected? It was kind of questions about his election, ultimately. That was the main thrust of it, from what he's told me. And later he called a friend of his, who kind of is in that world, and said, why were they asking me all this? And his friend kind of chuckled and said, well, they didn't predict you. They didn't see you coming, and so they needed to figure out, like, what the hell. I guess that our guess is that they didn't see Jesse coming and wanted to know how he won. And the most important question is, would we see more of them? More Jesse Venturas? Would this be duplicated? Is this a new trend in U.S. politics? Because, look, technically the CIA is not supposed to operate stateside. But
That doesn't stop.
That doesn't stop them, yeah. Legally they're not supposed to be operating stateside, but yeah. And I think, I would not put it past them to have their pulse on what's trying on the country of who they, where politically the country wants to go, so that they can then best either manipulate or move that or predict it. It makes sense. If they're going to do that in every other country around the world, why wouldn't they do it here? So that was that story that was wildly fascinating, because it was just kind of like, huh, really? Like this is what we're up to,
Welcome to the governorship.
Exactly, yeah, because it was in with like the first couple months of being governor.
Well, I can remember when your dad was running, I was back in Minneapolis. It was when my grandma was still living, so I'd spend at least 2 or 3 weeks in Minneapolis. And I was talking to various friends of mine, and I was very surprised at the demographics that were someone who I know is like a stoner. I mean, he makes the dude from The Big Lebowski look like an Olympic athlete. And he was voting for Jesse. And then I've got a friend who's a relatively conservative medical doctor, and he was voting for Jesse. And I was thinking to myself, wow, if he gets the spectrum like that are my friends, he's going to be governor. And lo and behold, I remember that night when he was declared governor. It was the pundits were just so completely flummoxed that your dad had become governor that they didn't. I remember they just didn't even know what to talk about. And
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it was shocking even to us. I mean, Jesse didn't go in to lose. He went into that election to win. He always, that's how he kind of lives his life. That's, he doesn't do anything to lose or just make a statement. He tries to go in to change things or do that. And we were shocked too. But I remember that night was fascinating, because I remember the moon had kind of an aura around it. It was a fall moon, and it had a little circle around it, and I was like, ooh, okay, this could get interesting. And it was shocking. I think it was Brokaw or somebody at the time, that one of the main anchors at the time said of Jesse's win. I think he said that if Fidel Castro was riding a hippopotamus down Pennsylvania Avenue, that might be just as shocking as Jesse's win tonight. Or he said something along those lines. Because it did. It shook up the status quo completely. No one expected him to win, and then no one expected him to do. One of the things that Jesse's most regarded for was that he put together, in governor terms, I don't think it's the right term, but in the governor's terms, he put together a cabinet that was. He still gets credit for to this day from both the right and the left, saying like, wow, you really picked people to be head of departments that really deserved it, and it wasn't like cronyism. He appointed, I think it was, oh man, I can't remember the number. He appointed, it might be like 72, 73 judges during his term. And once again, didn't pick them based on party affiliation. He set up a system to pick judges that was based on merit and not on cronyism, and not on like party affiliation, that to a certain degree, from what I've heard, they still use today, that same system. Jesse was able to do a lot despite the fact that he had both parties at times, especially in his last year, line up against him. He vetoed more than damn near any other governor in history, because he has line item veto as governor of Minnesota, and he was able to really hold them accountable and keep a lot of pork and keep a lot of garbage off of bills. Because every bill now has that Christmas tree effect, where it starts off as a good bill, and then by the time he reaches the desk, it's got about 50 things on it that have nothing to do with the original bill, because everyone's trying to get their slice of the pie or add shit to it. A lot of the things that he ran on, you now see 20 years later, are becoming, the norm today. He ran on infrastructure and got light rail in. He ran on LGBTQ rights and was fighting for equal rights and things like that for those groups 20 some years ago, before people were really talking about it today. He ran on legalizing marijuana and legalizing ending the drug war. Now that's taken hold 20 years later. So a lot of his policies that he was trying to implement, or at least talking about, Now, 20 years later, when you look back, you realize that he was thinking well ahead of his time. It took us 20 years to kind of get there. And if anything, I hope that the people remember that about his legacy and his time in office, because he really was trying to do what's right. Because Jesse's thing is always this: he doesn't need you to agree with every single political viewpoint he holds, but you know that it's coming from his heart. It's coming from what he believes in. It's not coming because a lobbyist told him to have that belief, or a political party said, well, that's what you should believe in. You know that Jesse's belief system are his own. And I think that really responded to people. I think that really resonated with people across the state. Like you're saying, Jesse had such a wide demographic of support. It was crazy. And he ended up winning. I think that extra 10% that really put him over the top was made up of the youth. He got a huge youth vote turnout, more than they'd ever seen, and also it was people that don't normally vote. Because we got to remember is that, like, in most elections, whether national or local, the percentages of people that actually take part are horribly low.
Yes.
And so which means, okay, you can count a lot of that to apathy. Just some people just don't give a shit. But I think a lot of that also comes from the fact that they really don't like who they have no one to vote for. They look at the two candidates and say, well, I don't like either of these people. And Jesse's, I think, just enough. He's by and large fiscally conservative and socially liberal. Don't spend gratuitously tons and tons of money on things that don't work. Shepherd the economy and try to make it work, and don't overspend. Well, at the same time, he's socially liberal and believes that, unless you hurt somebody else, there's no business. Government has no business telling you who to love or who you can't love, or what you can do with your body and what you can't do with your body. Jesse's, he's very socially liberal that way.
I knew that he was going to have a hard time, because in Minnesota, he was up against a Republican apparatchik named Norm Coleman, who would eventually become a senator, and Skip Humphrey, who was the scion of a political family and also a Democratic apparatchik. And I knew that when Jesse beat both Norm Coleman and Skip Humphrey, that the Democrats and Republicans were going to have no quarter there. that he was going to have to fight for everything that he believed in and wanted to do. And he did, actually, despite that strong gale of Republican and Democratic antipathy, he managed to implement a number of pretty good things.
He really did, because one of the things before his last year in office, where because they didn't know if he was running again, and so that both sides really got in bed with each other in that last year, the last year and a half. Before that, he was able to really pass a lot of things, because depending on what at the time, I think it was either the House, like Minnesota has a bicameral legislature, so you have the House and the Senate, and I think at the time, I could be wrong, but at the time, one party controlled one side, the other party controlled the other side. And so what that put Jesse into such a unique position to govern in is that for many years, depending on the issue, he could get one passed, right? So like if let's say if the issue came up as more Democrat, a lot of the Democrat side, the Senate side, or whatever it might be, supported that issue, he could get that passed as governor, because they both, like, he could get one side to agree with him and then the other side to agree with him. And so it kind of put him in a really nice catbird seat to do a lot of good in that process. And he was true to his word. He gave, I remember people got the Jesse checks because they had overtaxed us and had a huge surplus. It's what he ran on. And so I think for 2 cycles, he was able to give people back money that they were overtaxed to all Minnesotans. And the smartest thing he did too is he made it a sales tax rebate, which means you didn't have to declare it then on your taxes at the end of the year. And that really, allowed people, what people forget about that is economy. In a capitalistic economy, the people have to have money, right? You have to be spending in order for the economy to work. And the more money that gets put back into the middle class and lower, the better, because those are people that are going to be outspending. And Jesse knew that, and knew that it's unfair. We shouldn't, if we overtax them, we shouldn't then take that money and use it as if it's ours. It's not ours. It's taxpayers' money. So no, it was he had his ups and downs, and it was a tough 4 years, but he put his head down and did the work, and I think I hope that we see more people. I hope we see more Jesse Venturas in the future, and more independent third party people running for office, and then having that charisma and those and the beliefs to really reach to the hearts of people to that's how we're going to change this country. That's you got to get different people in there, because clearly what we have today doesn't work.
Well, Tyrell, I really want to thank you for coming on the Nick Bryant Podcast.
Thank you, man. It's a pleasure. It's been an honor and a pleasure knowing you for as long as we have now, and I love your work. Keep up the great work. Keep up the good writing, and keep putting out them books, man. It's fantastic reading your work, and I look forward to it.